Welcome to this video series around Jakarta EE9. In this video, I will show you how you can use Jakarta Faces to create web pages. This is already part 4 of the EE9 video series. So Jakarta Faces is a framework for server-side rendering. A few years ago, there was a major shift to client-side rendering, but again, a lot of frameworks are coming back to server-side rendering. So Jakarta Faces is still a good and popular choice for creating your web pages, and especially when you have administrative applications where you have a lot of data validation. It is based on components, so you define which components needs to be on your page and how they are linked with the Java classes, the CDI classes, as we will see, and then the framework renders a HTML structure that can be styled with CSS. We will also see how you can do validation and do partial page update so that you have a modern feel of the application. This video contains two parts. In the first part, we cover some basic functionality of the Faces framework, like creating web pages, linking to the Java CDI beans, and do some input validation. In the second part, we cover some more advanced topics, like the partial page refresh, templating, and styling of your application. So let us get started with a simple demo and build on that in the next few examples. So we have here again a Maven application where we will show a few functionalities of the Jakarta EE9 Faces framework. As before, we just need to import the web API Maven dependency at scope provided because the Jakarta runtimes always have the Faces functionality and the code already on board, so we can create a WAR file which only contains the application itself. For the configuration, most of the time it's not needed, but a lot of people still use this mapping that the XHTML URLs that they will map to the Faces servlet, and that the standard Faces servlet which we have available in the system is used for this purpose. So let us see how a Faces page looks like. So we can create a page. It's called so-called a facelets page. So let's create the index HTML file. So it is XML based, where we define a few namespaces. We have the namespace, the HTML namespace, where we normally assign the H alias to, which contains all the components which visual elements like an input field or an output text. The other namespaces will be covered later on, and we don't need it for this simple example. With JSF2, you should specify here the head and the body, because the JSF framework needs to send some JavaScript to the browser. So that is organized by using here the head element of the Faces namespace. And normally you can do an output here, an output text when you need to write something with value. You can do a hard-coded value, but you can also link to values that are stored in Java beans. We will have an example later on, but you can also combine it with regular HTML. So we can, for instance, include here a break for a new line. And that's, of course, because we have by default here also HTML available, and all the standard HTML elements are like this break due to this import here. This is another example of how you can combine the regular HTML with the faces components within this head. Here we can just use the title, as you can do with any regular HTML file. So let's have a look how that's visualized in the browser. So we can do a Maven clean package that we create here a WAR file. So we have here the WAR file created, and then we can deploy that on the server. I have here now the Payara server 6 as an example, because that's the one that is specifically designed for Jakarta EE9. But of course, this example you can also use on the Payara 5, because you can also deploy Jakarta namespace-based applications on Payara server 5. So we have here the server running, so we can deploy the WAR file. It is deployed successfully, and then we can have a look at the page. So JSF index XHTML page that we have created, and then we see the output from hello Jakarta EE Faces new line. So that is as expected. So let's switch to a new example, a bit more interesting one, where we make the link between the Faces webpage and a Java class. So let's start with the page itself. So we will call it a greeting, because we are going to create a greeting, some kind of hello world. So here we have again the standard template, and now it is with the HTML namespace. We have a title, so that's the Jakarta EE9 greeting as an example, and we will need to send data to the backend, to the server. So that means we need a forum this time. Everything needs to be enclosed in a forum, and we are going to ask for a certain name. So we need an input field, input text, and the value. That's something we will discuss later, how we will link to the Java Bean. And then when we have entered the value for the name, then we need a button which performs a command on the server. So that's with the listener principle. And so whenever we click on this button, then the listener, which we will define here, will be used to perform some kind of action. So the thing which is required depending on the button, and this time is a greeting. So in the back we will perform the greeting operation. And we also want to have some output back from the greeting. So that's again with the output text element. So we have here now 3 places where we need to have a link with the Java class. So let's create the CDI bean, because that is the way how Faces, the Jakarta Faces and Java are interconnected. It's through CDI. So we create a hello bean. And if you have watched the video around CDI, you know that there are different scopes. At that moment, we did not discuss request scope, but as you can imagine, this bean with request scope is created when it receives a request, and it is cleaned up after the response is sent. So that will make sure that every user, every request that is made gets a new bean, so that there is no interference between the calls, and that all the classes, all the instances are cleaned up so that there is no memory issue at the end. So we need a string value to store the name that we are entering on the screen. we also want to have a entry for the greeting, and they have different requirements. So we create a getter and a setter for the name, because the screen actually calls this set name method, but it can also be used later on to retrieve the value again. But for the greeting, we only want to have a getter, so we never want to set it from the page itself. So we only foresee a greeting, which makes this greeting property effectively read-only. And if we want to use it later on the page, it will not be possible to set the value from the page like an input text field, because it is read-only, we cannot write it. The actual greeting listener itself, so the functionality, is a regular Java method. It does not return anything itself, because that's through that property. Here within this method, we can perform the action that we need to do. If you have looked at the video around the REST, then you know that we have this CDI bean here for a greeting service. So let's reuse that one. This is a CDI bean, so we can inject the greeting service. So it's the greeting service that we are injecting here. And then the method can say that the greeting is the value which we get back from the greeting service greeting template. That's the template. We need to specify a language, but that's not implemented here. So let's do it like this way. This returns the template. So it is then a string format of this with the actual value which is filled in the screen, which is at that time already transferred to this name property. This is the logic. There is now one little thing that we need to do, that is make this being available, accessible from expressions, and so through the expression language, also part of Jakarta EE9, and we can do that by defining it as a named bean. So this named annotation defines a name for the CDI instance, which is instantiated based on this class. You can specify the value for it, so we can give a specific name. So we can say my hello bean, and then I can use this reference. But of course, it is easier and used by a lot of people that you do not specify a specific name, and then you get the hello bean as name itself as a variable reference. So now that we have the CDI part of it, the Java part of our example, we can fill in the missing pieces here. So we can make the link to that CDI class, or that by using that hello bean reference and using the name here. The listener, the same, but hello bean to greeting. So this is a method. So you can explicitly indicate that it is a method by using brackets, although that's not really required. Here it is the property, so he will use the getName and setName methods. And here we show the value of the greeting, so that's the greeting property that we specify here. So we can compile it again and redeploy the application to the server. And then we can have a look at the greeting page. So we have that greeting XHTML, we have that name, and here the greeting. We can put here Payara in as name. We can click on the button and we receive the output, hello Payara, because the listener attached to this button used that greeting service to get a template for the message, and we filled in the value. Now we have seen an example where you can interact with Java on the server side. The next step is, of course, that we want to have some kind of validation of the values that we have entered on the screen. There are two options. Either you can use the validation, the bean validation, which is another specification in Jakarta, to validate it based on the Java classes itself, but that's part of another video. Here we will show you how you can do it also from within the JSF components on the screen. And that is useful in some cases, but most of the time that bean validation is used because then it can be reused. For instance, if that same class is also part of your REST endpoint, then that validation is also reused there. But that's, as I mentioned, the content of another video. So suppose that we are entering a value for a person, the name and the age, and it is related to the editing of a person then. So we have a person edit bean. We have that request scope for the correct lifecycle and named so that it is usable in expressions. We have the name and we have the age of the person. And this time, of course, at the age, we will put here an integer value. This time, both age and the name are having getters and setters so that we can use them in input fields. So let's create then that page. We create a facelets page, person edit, where we again specify a form element, and we have a name entry with we have that input. The value is here that person edit bean name that we specified, and we have the age entry, so that's another input text field where we have person edit bean age. The values are, although that we will do the validation here within the JSF components, the values will be validated by the server. So JSF has different phases. One of the phases that it goes through for each request is that it validates the form elements which are sent to the server. So that means that we also need a command button to send the data to the server. This time I'm going to just put here the name. I'm not going to put an action listener. Command button already saves, sends the information to the server and checks if, for instance, the value within that field here, within that age field, is effectively an integer. So let's try that one out. So we have compiled and deployed again. So we have the person edit field here. We have name and age. One thing that we forgot to do is what happens when there is something wrong. So we can say, for instance, can put here hello as value. But of course, we do not see any error because we did not ask Faces to show the errors. So that's something that we missed here, is that we need to show the messages. You can either show the messages on top of the page, which is all the messages, but you can also decide that you want to have a certain message. You have an individual message for that field, related for a certain field. You see, you have that option for a field. So we could make appear the messages related to this age field here behind that field itself. So created the application and deployed it again. So we can again put here the name and the age, but we are making a mistake. And we put here a value, and when we click this time and save, you see that hello must be a number consisting of one or more digits. This message is customizable, but this is the default message saying that it's not an integer. This here is the uniquely generated identification for that field. That does not say much, of course, for the user. So that's one thing that we need to change. And we can do this by defining here the label, which needs to be used in error messages. In a real world project, of course, you will use the resource bundle, which also can be used within JSF to define labels like here on the front of the input field, as here the label of the error message itself. I immediately will show another option, is that you can also restrict even further the range that the number is allowed. Because age, of course, a negative value is not very meaningful. For that reason, we are using the other namespace that you saw in the beginning, and it is the core namespace. So HTML, as you have seen, that's all related to some visual input fields and messages on the screen. The core namespace, most of the time it's it's denoted by the alias f. You will have also things that are not visible but very useful. And one of the things is that you can the validation. So we can validate the range of the field with a minimum value, and we allow as a minimum 1 and maximum, I think 120 as maximum age is about right for the moment. And then the JSF system will automatically check not only if it's a number, but also if it's within the range that we have specified here. So let us try it out. So again, we have here the fields, and we put -12. And then he says, of course, you see that it's not between the range that we defined within the page. The advanced topics, like the partial page refresh templating and styling, will be covered in part B. See you there.